Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly trippy world of ancient Egyptian recreational chemistry, a civilization that gave us pyramids, mummies, and apparently festivals that could rival your college roommate's worst decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the ancient Egyptians' most famous botanical party trick, the blue lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings, elegant petals, usually being sniffed by pharaohs or gently waved around at banquets like an ancient version of cheers. But this flower wasn't just ornamental. The Egyptians believed it had sacred properties and mild psychoactive ones. Yes, the blue lotus could get you just a little bit floaty. The method was simple. Take the dried petals and soak them in wine for a while, sometimes days. Then drink the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably, whenever you felt like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at top volume. The result was a soft, dreamy euphoria, not enough to make you forget your name, but enough to make pyramid building sound like a fun group project. Now, to be clear, the Egyptians didn't call it getting high. They called it communing with the gods. Blue lotus was strongly associated with rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and funerary rites. Holding the flower to one's nose was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity. And, okay, maybe also a great way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. It was everywhere in art. Pharaohs are shown holding it. Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe. And even mummies got decorated with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're travelling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. Practical. But the blue lotus wasn't just ceremonial. Festivals could get wild, and blue lotus-infused wine made the music louder, the dancing looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry marginally more profound. Imagine a crowd under the stars, sipping lotus wine, feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze. For the ancient Egyptians, that was spiritual fulfillment, and also a very good night. There are religious holidays, and then there's the Feast of Drunkenness, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of saying, let's black out in honour of not dying. Subtle name? No. Accurate? Extremely. This annual celebration revolved around the goddess Hathor, who, according to myth, was once sent to punish humanity. But after a bloody spree that would make any disaster movie blush, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson. So they tricked her into drinking red beer that looked like blood. She passed out, woke up in a better mood, and just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through alcohol poisoning. To commemorate this heroic hangover, Egyptians gathered once a year to get thoroughly obliterated. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Literally. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance, which sounds poetic until you remember this often meant collapsing face first into a mud brick courtyard surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. The ritual began at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Priests encouraged revelers to drink as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. Participants banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the goddess, although whether that was Hathor or just the side of a clay jug is unclear. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honour the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be pacified with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets keg stand, and importantly, this was sanctioned behaviour. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Khnumhotep? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal. Participants purged their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorized party. The next day, headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar. It was thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque, served with the kind of consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer, for the Egyptians, was not just a social drink, it was practically a food group. Made from partially baked loaves of emmer bread that were soaked in water, mashed, and fermented into a chunky slurry, it resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. The technical term might be liquid bread, but let's not pretend this wasn't a bowl of carbs in denial. This beer was consumed by everyone: peasants, priests, children, scribes, and anyone else trying to survive in a world where desert heat, crocodiles, and public works projects were daily concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and cheaper than anything else that didn't require chasing it down with a spear. And here's the twist: beer wasn't just for sustenance. It was often intentionally altered with herbs, spices, and other curious additives, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Add some mandrake? Want to forget the priest's speech about cosmic order? Toss in a little fermented date juice and hope for the best. Of course, hygiene was a concern, but beer had an answer for that too. Water could kill you, but beer had been boiled, fermented, and spiced. It was safer than the Nile, and often more reliable than your co-workers. In terms of strength, Egyptian beer ranged from mildly numbing to, I forgot how sandals work. While the alcohol content wasn't high by modern standards, the sheer quantity consumed made up for it. Workers on state projects like pyramid building were often paid in beer, a daily ration of several litres, which means that half of ancient Egyptian labour was fueled by liquid gluten and mild intoxication. Let's talk beer. Or rather, let's talk about a viscous, beige, bread-adjacent fluid that the ancient Egyptians cheerfully called beer, and that modern brewers would call a war crime. Egyptian beer was less refreshing beverage and more fermented soup with ambition, made by soaking half-baked loaves of emmer bread in water, then mashing the whole affair into a lumpy stew and letting it ferment in open vats. The final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal if oatmeal had opinions and a mild buzz. But despite its texture, which archaeologists generously describe as rustic, this was the drink of the people. Everyone drank it: pharaohs, priests, peasants, toddlers. Because when water might kill you and milk was suspicious at best, beer was the least deadly option with a pleasant side effect. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal jugs, because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a pot of soggy bread water. At temples and festivals, the beer might be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, or mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just experimental. Historians are still unsure if the addition of mandrake was intentional, or if someone was just tired of reality. This was also the go-to payment method for labourers. Pyramid workers didn't clock out with coins. They received daily beer rations, sometimes several litres per day. This means the guys hauling limestone blocks all morning were doing it buzzed and breaded. And somehow the pyramids still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. Taste? Probably awful. But if you're living in 1300 BCE, covered in sand and trying not to die of dysentery, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge is Michelin star cuisine. Also, no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just ceramic jugs, straws with filters to catch the bigger bread chunks, and a national commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood. with smoke, but not just any smoke. We're talking kaifi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating or just very, very light-headed. Kaifi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by temple, but the ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. Mix it all up, let it ferment, dry it into pellets, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in ritual purification, which is code for, let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. Temples didn't have ventilation, by the way. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone cube next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kifi, like it's Fabreze for the soul, while a chant drones in Coptic monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged, they were practically inevitable. Whether divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. To the Egyptians, kaifi wasn't just air freshener, it was medicine, perfume, and spiritual elevator all in one. Pliny the Elder later wrote that kaifi could cure snake bites and improve sleep, which makes sense if you assume the goal was to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex, they read like ancient IKEA manuals. 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific moons. Honestly, it's a miracle anything got done. But once lit, the aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signalling that something holy was happening, or that someone was overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, kaifi lingered. It was burned during mummification, buried in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, kaifi was Egypt's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it, and breathe deeply. If Blue Lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and kaifi was the drama queen with a smoke machine, then Mandrake was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests, Mandrake was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare. Used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination. Mandrake earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals and pharaohs in a bad mood. The Ebers Papyrus, that handy ancient medical text that sounds like it belongs in a Harry Potter class, lists mandrake for insomnia, fertility, and strengthening the heart. Which sounds noble until you remember that the wrong dose could just as easily strengthen your heart into cardiac arrest. See, mandrake contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine, the kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, welcome to Night Terrors starring Ra and a crocodile in a wig. And then there's the harvesting myth. According to later folklore, likely inherited from these early associations, pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream. Loudly. Lethally. So naturally, the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears, and let the poor creature yank it free while you hoped your neighbours didn't ask too many questions. While there's no solid evidence the Egyptians were tying plants to dogs and waiting for shrieks, the idea that the plant had spiritual, and slightly terrifying, power fits right in. Mandrake may have been used in rituals, fertility rites, or just slipped into beer for those who preferred their hallucinations with a rooty aftertaste. In any case, it wasn't the everyday herb. Mandrake was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't mind taking medical advice from a man covered in gold leaf. Used carefully, it could induce sleep, reduce pain, and maybe inspire a sensual poem or two. Used recklessly, You'd wake up 4 days later convinced you were a scarab beetle. Somewhere in the vast scrolls of Egyptian medical wisdom, wedged between cures for crocodile bites and the proper placement of amulets on inflamed body parts, lies a quiet little mention of Shemshemet. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention or chewing reeds until they forgot their problems. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus and Ramesseum Papyrus, mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore eyes, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sounds like a modern wellness trend someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy. Of course, the Egyptians didn't roll joints or bake brownies with it. At least, not that we know of. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey, because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Applied topically, it soothed pain. Inhaled accidentally. Well, now the temple incense makes a lot more sense. Was it recreational? Officially, no. Unofficially, probably. When you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one blames you for accidentally over-medicating. And if your high priest starts talking to statues a little too confidently, well, who's to say that isn't divine wisdom? There's also physical evidence. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis, along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. And let's not ignore the priests. These were men trained to chant for hours, interpret dreams, and stare into incense smoke until something stared back. If their rituals involved cannabis, it wasn't for giggles. It was to facilitate communication with the gods, or at the very least, with the wall. Somewhere in the dimly lit, sweet-smelling corners of the ancient Egyptian temple pharmacy, just behind the dried lizards and holy ointments, sat the opium stash. Small, wrinkled poppy pods imported from the eastern Mediterranean, tucked away like a divine secret. Because when you've got plague, pain, and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes prayer alone doesn't cut it. Though not native to Egypt, opium poppies likely made their debut through trade with Cyprus or Crete. The Egyptians were nothing if not enthusiastic early adopters. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in mild addiction. Opium didn't just dull pain, it smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed gastrointestinal rage, and made temple chants about cosmic balance feel like they actually had a beat. Administered in drinks, pills, or occasionally as suppositories, because of course, it became the pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "Shh, don't worry about it." Naturally, it found a home in the temple medicine cabinet, that sacred shelf where healing met holy mystery. Priests, doubling as physicians, administered it during rituals and serious treatments, probably while saying things like, "This will ease the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was angry or your molars were, opium could calm them both. The ancient texts don't call it opium directly, of course. That would be too helpful. They reference extracts from the poppy plant, in the same vague way modern labels say natural flavours, which is never comforting. But let's not pretend this was all medicinal. There's always a blurry line between spiritual elevation and a really good nap. And for elite Egyptians, especially those being embalmed, opium might have been part of the final send-off. What better way to face the underworld than totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? Like many of Egypt's sacred substances, opium was part cure, part comfort, and part controlled chaos. Used wisely, it soothed agony. Used poorly, it turned temple assistants into spaced-out background dancers. Still, in a world of tooth drills, snakes, and sandstorms, a little somnolent magic went a long way. Wine in ancient Egypt was a sign of sophistication, a drink of the gods, a toast to Osiris. But don't let the elegant amphorae fool you. This stuff could hit like a chariot accident, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Wines weren't just fermented grape juice, they were infusions, concoctions, and occasionally mild experiments in altered consciousness. Egyptians flavoured their wine with everything from mandrake and blue lotus to myrrh and frankincense. Ingredients that sound spiritual until you realise they were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were the main setting for these potent potables. At the Feast of Drunkenness, for example, participants didn't sip wine to appreciate terroir. They chugged it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The idea wasn't to be tipsy. It was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a leopard skin. These spiked brews were often described in medical texts as remedies, which is how you know things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try a wine infused with fermented lotus. Sore joints? How about some frankincense-infused red, aged 2 weeks in a clay pot? Existential dread? Well, that one needed priestly supervision, and possibly a floor mat, and it wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, left as offerings in tombs, and used in ceremonies to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average table wine. Depending on the additives, these sacred brews could calm nerves, ease pain, or launch a midsummer banquet into full psychedelic mystery cult territory. And because everything was part of a ritual, no one could really question the dosage. If the room spun, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the lotus garden, that was divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine wasn't just a beverage. It was a vehicle, one that could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. For a civilization obsessed with order, ritual, and geometry, the ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly open mind about trance states. In fact, they encouraged them, just not during accounting. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the divine, or at least to some deeply theatrical inner monologue. Possession, divine, not demonic, was often treated as a religious promotion, not a medical emergency. If a temple dancer started convulsing mid-routine, she wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes. She was applauded. Hathor had arrived, apparently, and had strong opinions about tambourine tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honoured combo of repetitive drumming, rhythmic chanting, smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, and wine with mysterious floaties in it. The result? Sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. Priests and priestesses alike were trained to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rituals. This included changes in voice, posture, and a sudden urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a fire. In many temples, it was just another Wednesday. To outsiders, it may have looked like a mass fainting spell, but within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised. Sometimes they scolded. Sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. The trance wasn't always voluntary either. There are accounts of the afflicted being taken by deities, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and suspicious amounts of incense. Whether these were actual divine messages or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of Kifai smoke next to a flaming brazier is still debated. Of course, once the trance ended, the possessed party returned to normal, often looking slightly disoriented and very sweaty. The ritual concluded with applause, a sip of sacred wine, and possibly a nap behind a pillar, while someone else mopped up the sanctified drool. To modern eyes, divine possession might look like performance art meets heatstroke. But to ancient Egyptians, it was the pinnacle of religious experience, the moment when the divine broke through the sandstone barrier of reality to drop a few cryptic life tips. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party. Not in ancient Egypt. The line between the living and the dead was more of a soft suggestion, like, don't swim after eating, or maybe don't chisel hieroglyphs drunk. Egyptians didn't just respect the dead, they actively included them in social plans. This wasn't metaphorical. Families visited tombs during festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, lugging baskets of food, jugs of beer, and the general vibe of a tailgate party, if the tailgate was parked in a necropolis. They'd sit outside the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the deceased, which usually meant talking to the wall and hoping Grandma appreciated the pickled fish. Many tombs had false doors, carved portals through which the dead could receive offerings. Whether this meant spiritually or just enjoying the smell from the other side is unclear. Either way, ancient Egyptians believed the dead could still enjoy food, drink, music, and a decent bit of gossip. So naturally, they threw them parties. Music was played, incense was burned, libations were poured. Sometimes the living got drunk enough to cry, confess secrets, or accidentally sit on sacred offerings. It was like a family reunion, only with fewer arguments and slightly more embalming fluid. These gatherings weren't just acts of remembrance, they were also mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead, in theory, blessed the living in return. Good crops, protection, fewer nightmares involving hippos. Everyone won. Sometimes people even slept overnight in tombs, hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones, or the occasional unsolicited advice from a former accountant turned ghost. Stop lending money to your brother, the dream might say. And also, the amulets go on the left. To modern sensibilities, this sounds macabre. To the Egyptians, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye, it was just a new address. And if Great Uncle Horemheb wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through a stone wall, who were they to say no? For all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned debauchery, ancient Egyptian revelry came with a price, and it usually arrived sometime around sunrise with a pounding headache and the vague memory of yelling at a statue. Yes, even in a world where Blue Lotus was medicine and beer was breakfast, the morning after hit just as hard. Archaeological texts are suspiciously quiet on the subject of hangovers, which is probably because no one was in the mood to write hieroglyphs when their head felt like it had been smited by Ra himself. But the evidence is there. Medical papyri describe pains of the head and recommend treatments involving herbs, honey, and sometimes just lying very still while pretending to commune with the gods. In more advanced cases, a ritual cleansing was recommended, which usually involved a priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and possibly a stern lecture on moderation that no one remembered hearing. The real trick, of course, was plausible deniability. If you'd danced shirtless in the temple or passed out in a tomb alcove, you didn't say, "I overdid it." You said, "I was overcome by the divine." It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Hathor's laughter. Much more respectable. And for the truly unlucky. There was always purging. Not metaphorically. Literally. The Egyptians were fond of emetics. Lovely concoctions designed to evacuate your sins from both ends. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like regret, and being told, "This will restore your balance." Moments later, your balance is definitely gone. The priests, of course, fared better. They had training. They had ritual authority. And most importantly, they had people to carry them home. Meanwhile, common revelers woke up with lotus petals in their hair and sandal imprints on their faces, wondering whether they'd danced with a god or just someone very committed to the role. Still, no one swore off the next celebration, because spiritual enlightenment, as it turns out, is addictive, especially when it comes with beer, smoke, and a mild chance of falling into a trance and yelling your neighbour's secrets in front of a statue. When ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent eulogy. They packed snacks, and drugs, and possibly a backup stash, just in case eternity got boring. Because if you thought the partying stopped after your heart was weighed, think again. it just moved underground. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes for the soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. Mummies were entombed with blue lotus petals, wine jugs, incense cones, and the occasional sealed mystery jar, which archaeologists now eye with both reverence and mild suspicion. Take Tutankhamun, for example. When Howard Carter cracked open his tomb, he didn't just find gold and furniture. He found wine, oils, herbs, and what can only be described as the ancient Egyptian version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the canopic jars. This wasn't just luxury, it was strategic. The soul, or ba, if you're fancy, needed nourishment and stimulation in the afterlife. Eternal bliss wasn't going to maintain itself after all. So priests and embalmers made sure you were entombed with all your spiritual comfort items, food offerings, sacred perfume, and a generous dose of whatever got you through long temple ceremonies while pretending to be enlightened. Some tombs even include instructions to the dead on how to prepare and enjoy these items in the afterlife. It's not enough to carry blue lotus into eternity. Apparently, you also needed directions in case divine short-term memory was a thing. And let's not forget the opening of the mouth ritual, which was supposed to let the dead eat, speak, and, let's be honest, sip that sacred fermented beverage with proper technique, because it's hard to toast Osiris with a closed jaw. All of this tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was a psychoactive flower soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb, along with your amulets, your linen headrest, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. Ancient Egypt gave the world pyramids, mummies, and eyeliner that could block out the sun. But it also perfected an unspoken truth of civilization. Sometimes the people running things are just high enough to think it's going well. Officially, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, chosen by the gods to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order. Unofficially, temple priests had the keys to the sacred stash, the incense budget, and the daily schedule of who gets to chant next to a burning bush of Kai-Fi until they pass out. The religious elite weren't just spiritual guides. They were state-sanctioned pharmacists, supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion. If it smelled strong, tingled on contact, or made you speak in metaphor for 3 days, it probably came out of the priesthood's apothecary. And while pharaohs wore the crowns, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandrake with wine and not kill anyone. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power. Not just in healing and ritual, but in managing the emotional and mystical tone of society. You didn't ask, what's going on with the harvest? You asked, what did the high priest see in his trance last night? Spoiler, it was usually a falcon and a lot of swirling gold light. Let's not forget the economic side. The temples were landowners, employers, and massive centres of drug production. Blue lotus didn't grow itself. Someone had to harvest it, dry it, ferment it, and whisper to it in sacred verse. So yes, religion was very holy, but it was also a well-oiled machine, one that ran on faith, herbs, and occasionally mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. In many ways, the question of who ruled Egypt was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. Because if the gods spoke through visions, and the visions came after a priest sniffed something pungent in a sealed chamber, well, you do the math. In theory, ancient Egypt was all about balance, justice, and order. In practice, if you were rich enough to afford a private tomb and someone to fan you while you digested, you also had access to the good stuff, the kind of narcotic rarities that didn't show up in the village clinic scrolls. Make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a hierarchy, and mind-altering substances followed the same rules as everything else. Pharaoh at the top, goat herder at the bottom, and everyone else politely sniffing dried flowers and pretending it was enough. While commoners got barley beer and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they leaned close enough, the elite were bathing in blue lotus oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. Some of the more potent substances, mandrake, kai-fi blends laced with opium, imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Funny how that worked out. Take Pharaoh himself. The divine ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt couldn't be expected to process the metaphysical weight of ruling without a little help from the sacred pharmacopoeia. If his dreams were considered state messages from the gods, then sedating his insomnia with a psychoactive nightcap wasn't indulgence, it was national security. Even in death, the elite kept their stash close. Many tombs contain medicinal vials, incense cones, and wine jars with labels so vague they may as well have read, for ceremonial purposes only. One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if Tutankhamun just liked to keep his options open. Meanwhile, the lower classes weren't exactly locked out of the experience. They just had to settle for the watered-down versions. Beer thick enough to chew, weak incense, and whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift building obelisks. And when someone did get their hands on a forbidden substance without a permit, that was likely called witchcraft, heresy, or a very bad day to be a field labourer. After 14 chapters of sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, one might be tempted to ask, what does all this really say about ancient Egypt? Well, for starters, it tells us they were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a sistrum and the smell of something smouldering that definitely wasn't FDA approved. It also reveals just how much the ancients respected the power of altered states. Not as escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight, healing, and the occasional god with an animal head and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just pageantry. They were controlled chemical theatre, with incense, chanting, and psychotropic tea for the cast, and the strict gatekeeping of sacred substances. That's just the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their Blue Lotus spas and imported opium. Everyone else got lukewarm beer and an eye infection. Divine enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the luxury tomb package with optional afterlife minibar. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't that different from modern humans meditating with essential oils or arguing about microdosing on podcasts. They just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations more seriously. So, what does this mean for us? Well, maybe that our ancestors weren't primitive drug enthusiasts or eccentric spiritualists. Maybe they were just doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, often painful world, with the tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve wine, wildflowers, and a trance where you barked like Anubis, so be it. Florence, late 1400s. The air was thick with incense, sweat, and the perfume of crushed roses. The city was bursting with art, intellect, and political intrigue, but also a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty. And not just any beauty. Renaissance beauty. The kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue, even if it killed you. Enter Sarasa, a luxurious, silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Florence, Venice, and beyond smeared this shimmering poison across their cheeks, foreheads, and décolletage to achieve that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant labouring under the sun like a peasant, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, Sarusa was layered on like Venetian stucco. Some women went so far as to sleep in it, refusing to wash their faces, allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result? A radiant, ghostly glow, right up until the sores appeared, and when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them. You know, like a Renaissance band-aid. One that guaranteed the wound would never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming element in the Renaissance beauty arsenal. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine, marketed as elegance. And let's not forget the classism baked into every powdered pore. Noblewomen wanted their skin to look untouched by sunlight or hardship, so the paler, the better, even if it made them anemic, delirious, or eventually dead. Looking divine came at a divine cost. But perhaps the most ironic part, the women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from the Orient, rosewater distillations and camphor-laced tonics. They literally smelled like angels while their skin peeled off in sheets. If you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a Botticelli painting, or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. A high, rounded forehead was considered the epitome of beauty. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared. So women willingly yanked out rows of hair from their brows, and along their hairline with tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-time affair, it was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, women rubbed in concoctions made from walnut oil or cat dung, yes, cat dung, to thin the regrowth. Some even scorched stray hairs off with candle flames, because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows, thin, arched and barely visible, if at all. A truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows. Instead, a soft shadow or trace was painted in later, often with burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realise it smeared terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Mass. Divine. Meanwhile, body hair was seen as animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quicklime and arsenic, another charming blend. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth. Until it didn't. And the scalp? Hair was gathered up into tight, rigid styles, often braided and padded with false hair made from wool, horsehair, or someone else's actual hair. Sometimes hair pieces were soaked in lye and bleached to match the fashionable golden hue of the season. If it didn't match, no worries. Just wear a cap over it and pretend it did. Renaissance problem solving at its finest. The irony? All this hair removal and sculpting was done without mirrors. That's right, mirrors were rare and expensive. Most women styled themselves by feel, with help from servants, so your maid better have steady hands and zero passive aggression. One wrong move, and your widow's peak becomes a monk's tonsure. Renaissance beauty was less about natural charm, and more about strategic subtraction. Remove the brows, remove the hairline, remove common sense, all in the name of elegance. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into shapes the human ribcage had no business aspiring to. Enter the Renaissance corset, equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic trauma. Renaissance corsets weren't quite the wasp-waisted death traps of later centuries, but they still meant business. Known as stays or bodies, these early versions were designed to flatten the torso, not cinch it. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasized the bust and elongated the silhouette. Because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank? The stiffening materials? Whalebone if you were rich, reeds or pasteboard if you weren't, all of it sewn into linen and laced tightly across the back. Getting into one required assistance, determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armoured artichoke, layered, spiked, and strangely delicate. And corsets weren't just about looks, they were moral statements. A straight, upright posture indicated inner virtue. Slouching, on the other hand, suggested moral laxity and possibly demonic possession. So if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, walked stiffly, and breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points if you fainted gracefully in public. That just meant you were doing it right. Underneath, linen chemises helped absorb sweat, because newsflash, Florence in summer was not a place for heavy fabrics and no airflow. But elegance came first. Comfort came never. And yet, despite the discomfort, corsets had one major benefit. They held everything in place. Unlike modern bras that pretend to offer support while staging a quiet rebellion by noon, Renaissance stays offered the kind of structural reinforcement usually reserved for bridges. You could run, dance, or survive a fainting spell without anything shifting an inch. Of course, not everyone could afford such architectural fashion. Working-class women went without stays, favouring looser bodices and more breathable materials. But among the elite, corsets were essential. You weren't fully dressed without one, just tragically undone. The worst part? You had to eat while wearing one. Which brings us to the next Renaissance fashion paradox: feasting like royalty, while trying not to split a seam or collapse from restricted airflow. In Renaissance Italy, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It extended all the way to the dinner table, where fashion and food had an uneasy relationship. On the one hand, noblewomen were expected to attend lavish banquets and engage in the social theatre of feasting. On the other hand, they had to do it while squeezed into a corset so tight, their internal organs were basically roommates. Meals were grand affairs. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacock, marzipan sculptures, and gilded fruit. But for upper-class women, actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sip, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric, and potentially dangerous given the boning in your bodice. Instead, you were expected to take dainty bites, keep your back straight, and smile through the growing pressure in your ribs. Sometimes the act of sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was enough to trigger a fainting spell, which, frankly, only added to the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome courtier. Très chic. Of course, this polite self-starvation had limits. Many noblewomen were secretly ravenous by the time they reached their private chambers, where they could finally remove the corset and devour a hidden stash of sweetmeats or leftover cheese. Yes, even Renaissance beauty queens had midnight snacks. They just couldn't admit it. And there were rules even for those. Certain foods were believed to affect the complexion. Cucumbers were discouraged. They made the skin watery. Wine was encouraged. It flushed the cheeks with colour. Some ladies even drank vinegar tonics to stay trim, because nothing says high fashion like ruining your gut lining. There was also the matter of digestion. In a corset, your stomach had nowhere to go. Women had to pace their eating carefully, or risk indigestion, bloating, or, God forbid, a very unladylike burp, the horror. So while men got to recline, drink heavily, and argue about Dante, women mastered the art of elegant restraint, eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to ruin the line of their gown. Once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the corset tightened, and the food politely nibbled, it was time to smell expensive. In Renaissance Florence, your scent wasn't just a finishing touch, it was a social weapon. A noblewoman's fragrance was as carefully curated as her lineage, and failing to smell like imported luxury was basically a scandal. The Renaissance nose had standards. Common folk might reek of garlic, goat, and existential dread, but the elite, they wafted through salons and basilicas trailing clouds of rosewater, musk, ambergris, and exotic spices. If you walked past a duchess, and didn't feel mildly intoxicated by her scent, she wasn't trying hard enough. Perfume was big business. Italy, especially Venice, was the European hub for distillation, but the most coveted ingredients came from farther afield. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from Ceylon, and ambergris, a waxy, oddly pleasant-smelling substance from the intestines of sperm whales. It was outrageously expensive and wildly fashionable. Basically the Renaissance equivalent of dabbing yourself with designer whale bath. These perfumes weren't just for pulse points. They were soaked into gloves, stitched into dress linings, and sprayed onto handkerchiefs that ladies would flutter dramatically whenever someone less hygienic came too close, which was often. Streets were filthy. People bathed irregularly. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was armour. And for the ambitious beauty, scent layering was essential. First came the scented bath, usually a rinse of rosewater or camphor, then a dusting of crushed violet petals, followed by an oil rubbed into the temples or wrists, and finally, a heavy mist of whatever concoction your apothecary swore would make men weep and rivals faint. Some even wore pomanders, delicate perforated orbs filled with aromatic herbs around the neck or waist. Others dangled them from their belts, like olfactory warning bells. Approach with caution. I smell of cinnamon and judgment. But these potions weren't always benign. Some perfumes contained turpentine, or tinctures so strong they could trigger headaches, nausea, or fainting. One wrong blend and you went from seductive to insufferable. Still, the right fragrance could open doors, or at least noses. A woman who smelled divine had power. Power to entrance, distract, or just to survive a crowd of unwashed poets. If Renaissance beauty was a battlefield, then fashion was the armour, and Florence was its glittering war zone. The fabric you wore didn't just say something about you, it screamed, it sang. It flounced down the street declaring your family's wealth, your husband's rank, and whether or not you had any shame in bankrupting him for a sleeve. Velvet was the crown jewel. Imported, dyed and woven with the kind of care usually reserved for saints' relics, velvet was thick, heavy and absurdly expensive. Wearing it in summer, a true power move. You were hot, yes, but you were important. Then came brocade. Not content with mere colour, brocade brought patterns into the picture. Lions, vines, even entire religious scenes woven in gold thread. And we're not talking about subtle accents. These were gowns that could double as altarpieces. The more intricate the design, the more time and money it took, which meant the more smugly you could nod at other women's inferior sleeves. Sleeves, by the way, were detachable. A practical feature turned competitive sport. Wealthy women owned entire wardrobes of sleeves to mix and match, flaunting them like today's designer handbags. Embroidered, puffed, slashed, pearl-encrusted. Some sleeves were so elaborate they needed their own storage system. And occasionally, their own servants. Colours were coded too. Deep blues and crimsons were made with rare dyes like lapis lazuli and cochineal. Pigments so expensive they were locked away like treasure. Only the rich could afford these hues, and sumptuary laws in places like Florence tried, and failed, to restrict certain colours to the nobility. But laws are boring. Dresses were not. Even the underlayers were ornate. Chemises were trimmed with lace. Petticoats peeked out in silken flashes. And girdles, belt-like accessories, weren't just decorative. Some were studded with gems and hidden pockets for perfume, prayer books, or possibly revenge notes. But all this fashion came at a price, literally. A single gown could cost more than a year's wages for a craftsman, and yet noble women didn't just have these gowns, they needed them. Every social event was a stage, and every outfit a statement. Wearing the same thing twice? Social suicide. Renaissance fashion didn't stop at the ankle, though, in fairness, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept decently hidden beneath layers of brocade and silk, which was a pity, considering how completely ridiculous Renaissance footwear often was. Let's start with the Chopin. The most theatrical shoe ever invented, Chopin's were essentially high platform soles. Think ancient Roman sandals crossed with stilts. Originally from Venice, they were designed to keep fine dresses above the muddy, plague-infested streets. But over time, function gave way to fashion, and Chopin's got taller. Much taller. Some were over 20 inches high. Yes, that's not a typo. 20 inches. Wearing them required balance, training, and frequently a servant on each arm. Walking unaided was considered both a physical feat and a social risk. If you fell, you didn't just lose your dignity, you might take out half the wedding party with you. In Florence, Chopin's weren't quite as extreme, but the trend still trickled down. Wealthy women wore delicate pointed slippers, often made of velvet, embroidered with silk thread and lined with fur. These were indoor shoes. Outdoors, you wore pattens, wooden or cork platforms, strapped underneath your slippers to protect them from the street. A practical solution, unless you tripped and shattered your kneecaps on cobblestones. Foot binding wasn't a thing in Renaissance Italy, but the pressure to have dainty, narrow feet absolutely was. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and not built for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could glide from sedan chair to palace hall, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches? And then there were the stockings. Women wore finely knit hose made of silk or wool, tied at the knee with ribbons. These ribbons were sometimes scented, because if someone caught a glimpse of your shin, you at least wanted to smell fabulous. Of course, lower class women wore simpler shoes, sturdy leather for labour, clogs for wet work. But the noble class treated footwear like a secret weapon, unseen, impractical, and incredibly expensive. All of it reinforced a single message. Real ladies didn't walk, they floated, they glided, they suffered gracefully and in style. After hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, stuffed, and platformed, what came next? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the Renaissance beauty ritual like trying to glide across a polished marble floor in 20 pounds of fabric and 2 inches of breathable lung space. Courtly dances were serious business. These weren't your carefree tavern-style reels. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, elegant, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every step was rehearsed, every movement symbolic. The wrong foot placement could imply social ineptitude. A misstep? Scandalous. You might as well shout, "I own nothing in lapis lazuli," and run barefoot into the Arno. For noble women, dancing was a test of composure. The most popular forms, like the pavan or the galliard, required gliding in precise patterns, keeping your gaze modest, and never, under any circumstance, breathing through your mouth. That was considered undignified. Which is unfortunate, because corsets did not allow for deep breaths. Every galliard leap was a calculated gamble against passing out cold. And yet, it was crucial. A woman's grace on the dance floor was as vital to her reputation as her dowry. Parents hired dance tutors the way modern influencers hire lighting designers. You learned how to turn, how to bow, how to fan yourself just enough to be mysterious, but not so much that you looked sweaty. The goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your shoes blistered and your ribs whimpered. There was also the matter of social strategy. Dancing offered rare opportunities to interact, briefly, with eligible men. Gloved hands touched for a moment, eyes met during a bow, perfumes mingled. It was flirtation with footnotes. But say too much, move too boldly, or, heaven forbid, laugh. You risked ruining your entire aesthetic of pious elegance. Meanwhile, the background noise of every court event was a choir of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. Servants whispered, tutors fretted, and all the while you had to maintain the illusion that none of it mattered. But it did. A clumsy turn or an off-rhythm curtsy could haunt you for weeks. So you danced, you smiled, you endured. And when the music finally stopped, you excused yourself to repowder your sweat-streaked Sarossa before round 2. The guests had departed. The candles had melted into waxy puddles. and the Renaissance noblewoman, divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside, finally made it back to her chambers. But sleep? Not yet. First came the Renaissance version of the night routine. Spoiler alert, it was less self-care and more controlled deterioration. Step 1. The unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, rosewater, and raw egg whites. The lead-based Sarusa had to be gently removed, not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would take skin with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to lift the layers, hoping their complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler, it usually was. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins and fake braids were uncoiled. Any adhesive used to keep forehead wigs in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. Ladies hoped the cat dung and quicklime they used for hair removal earlier in the week hadn't left bald patches. No pressure. Next, the corset unlacing, a spiritual experience, one that usually involved gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as ribs regained their original shape. Women could finally breathe. Not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and maybe whisper, "never again," for the 100th time. The feet were peeled out of slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what used to be toes. If you were lucky, your servant brought a basin of warm water with lavender or rosemary to soak them. If not, you just stared at your feet and wondered if you'd ever feel joy again. Finally, you were rubbed down with sweet oils, or, if you were particularly devout or paranoid, an alchemical tonic promising to preserve your youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and probably contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain. Also possibly pestilence. And then, at last, the candle was blown out. Not with a huff, still too improper, but a delicate puff, like you were apologizing to the flame. You lay back, hairline 2 inches farther back than it was last year, skin slightly more ghostly than the day before, lungs recovering from corset trauma. But tomorrow, you'd do it all again. Because in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't just a look, it was a lifestyle. A full-time, high-stakes performance with no intermission. And the audience? Everyone. Before Irezumi became linked to crime syndicates and back-alley parlours, tattoos in Japan carried a far more complex and layered identity, one deeply rooted in honour, mythology, and labour. Long before the Edo period, Japanese tattoos were used as punitive marks, burned or etched into criminals' faces and arms to permanently brand them as outcasts. But by the 1600s, these crude symbols had evolved into something far more intricate, something closer to art, devotion, and even spiritual armour. In Edo Japan, society was rigidly structured. Class divisions were clear. Samurai had swords, merchants had rules. Everyone else? They had restrictions. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict codes on dress and behaviour, especially for the lower classes. Ornate robes, luxurious fabrics, and flashy jewellery were reserved for the elite. But human nature always finds a loophole. For the common man, especially labourers, firemen, and gamblers, tattoos became a way to reclaim beauty, status, and identity. If you couldn't wear brocade on the outside, why not wear it on your skin? And so, full-body tattoos flourished underground, hidden beneath plain work clothes but revealed in bathhouses, festivals, and moments of intimacy. These weren't random designs. They were stories. Sleeves of swirling dragons, bodysuits of phoenixes, koi fish, cherry blossoms, Buddhist deities, and folkloric heroes. Each tattoo carried meaning. A koi swimming upstream symbolized perseverance. A dragon on the back meant power and protection. These motifs weren't chosen on a whim. They were earned, sometimes one painful inch at a time, and the process was brutal. There were no machines, no antiseptic creams. Artists, called horishi, used wooden handles and steel needles to hand-poke ink beneath the skin. The ink was often mixed with charcoal or natural pigments, hammered in using rhythmic strikes. Sessions lasted hours, full bodysuits could take years, but the result? A living mural that turned skin into storytelling. Yet, despite their cultural richness, tattoos remained illegal for much of the Edo period. Authorities viewed them as signs of disorder, deviance, or wastefulness. And so, the art of Irezumi thrived in the shadows, respected by some, feared by others, and completely invisible to the ruling elite. In Edo period Japan, where wooden buildings were packed like kindling and open flames lit every lantern, fires were constant and devastating. The samurai might have ruled the land, but when your neighborhood caught fire, it was the fireman, Keishi, who saved your life. These weren't firemen as we imagine today. They didn't use hoses or wear flame-retardant suits. Instead, they carried hooks, axes, and raw courage. Their job wasn't to extinguish fires, it was to tear down nearby structures and create fire breaks before the flames could spread. This meant climbing onto burning rooftops and dismantling homes by hand, often while embers rained from the sky. Naturally, these men developed a culture of bravado, toughness, and brotherhood, and central to that culture was tattooing. Full-body tattoos, Irezumi Horimono, became a badge of honor among the Haikushi. Not only were they stunning displays of strength and endurance, they were deeply symbolic. Dragons for power, tigers for courage, gods and demons for spiritual protection. When a fireman stripped off his uniform to reveal a full suit of swirling ink, it wasn't vanity, it was armor. And the pain? It was part of the point. Sitting for hundreds of hours while needles punctured the skin was a rite of passage. If you could endure that, you could face down an inferno. The tattoos weren't just decoration. They were proof of fearlessness, commitment, and pain endured for the good of the group. Some crews even shared themes, with all members sporting similar motifs to reflect unity. You'd see entire teams marked with identical dragons across their backs, or coordinated waves and blossoms swirling down their arms. This wasn't gang behaviour. It was solidarity, brotherhood forged through smoke and fire. But it wasn't legal. Tattoos were still frowned upon by the authorities, seen as vulgar or wasteful, especially for public servants. So the Hikeshi wore their ink beneath their clothes, only revealed in private bathhouses or celebratory festivals, where their role as local heroes gave them a pass, at least temporarily. Ironically, these same men were admired in their neighborhoods and feared by the elite. Their tattoos were marks of danger to some, of devotion to others. Beyond the fire brigades and labor crews, another group embraced the painful elegance of Irezumi, the gamblers, rogues, and thrill-seekers of Edo's underground. These were the drifters of the ukiyo, the floating world, a term that described both the pleasure quarters and the transient nature of existence itself. And in that fleeting world, tattoos were a language of risk, identity, and rebellion. Many of these men were bakuto, professional gamblers who roamed the country with dice, cards, and an uncanny ability to separate samurai from their stipends. While the bakuto had no formal organization at first, they lived by their own codes of loyalty, honor, and toughness. In a society that relegated them to the fringes, tattoos became a way to reclaim dignity, to turn a marginal life into one of meaning, one needle prick at a time. Their tattoos were bold, provocative, and unapologetically visible in the right settings. Peonies, fierce warriors, gods of fortune, and snakes slithered across their torsos. These weren't the quiet, contemplative inkings of monks or the civic pride of firemen. These were power statements. Visual declarations that said, "I don't follow your rules, I live by my own." Many designs referenced famous characters from Japanese folklore and kabuki theatre, heroes like Sakata Kintoki, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, or even mythical rebels who challenged authority. The more outrageous the figure, the more admired the tattoo. It wasn't just skin-deep symbolism, it was branding in a society where no one handed you a name unless you fought for it. And yet, despite their outsider status, These men were crucial to the underground economy. They lent money, maintained order in red light districts, and developed early proto-Yakuza structures. Their tattoos became both a badge and a warning. Loyalty within, danger without. Tattooing shops flourished in this world, not always marked with signs, but known through whispers and connections. The Horishi became revered figures, their work whispered about in bathhouses and behind sake counters. To be inked by a famous master was an honor. To endure the hours of stabbing pain, a show of grit. For gamblers and rogues, Irezumi was more than art. It was an identity carved in pain, proudly worn in a world that had no place for them. Though tattooing in Edo, Japan is often portrayed as a masculine tradition of labourers, firefighters and gamblers, women also left their mark, sometimes quite literally, on this hidden world of ink. While rarely documented in official records, female tattoos existed quietly, tenderly, and rebelliously beneath the layers of silk and propriety. In many cases, these tattoos were intimate, romantic, personal. Unlike the large mythological bodysuits of their male counterparts, women's tattoos were often smaller, discreet, and emotionally charged. Lovers would tattoo each other's names on hidden parts of their bodies, inside the upper arm, on the inner thigh, near the collarbone. A gesture known as Irezumi Chobu, love tattoos. A popular phrase inked onto women's skin was Inochi Azukemasu, meaning, I entrust you with my life. It was more than a vow. It was a declaration of emotional surrender, written in pain. Men sometimes carried similar inscriptions, showing mutual commitment beyond what any formal wedding could offer. This kind of tattooing was especially common among lovers in the ukiyo, the floating world of pleasure districts where courtesans and geisha reigned. Among high-ranking courtesans, tattoos were sometimes a tool of seduction, a small teasing mark, visible only when a robe slipped just right, became part of the mystique. It gave the illusion of intimacy, as if a client was seeing something forbidden. In reality, the tattoo may have been shared with dozens of clients, each believing it was a private secret. In other cases, tattoos signified heartbreak or betrayal. A courtesan might burn or slash a name tattooed on her body after a lover abandoned her, turning passion into scarred testimony. Some even covered these names with new ink, dragons swallowing letters, waves washing away memories. But for women outside the pleasure quarters, tattoos could also be acts of quiet rebellion. Peasant women, fisher women, or wives of tattooed men sometimes followed suit, inspired by the artistry or solidarity. Though they risked judgment, these women wore their ink privately, under their robes, as silent declarations of autonomy. While Edo society officially condemned such markings, especially on women, these tattoos carved out a hidden narrative, one of love, agency, and pain born voluntarily. A story the official histories never bothered to write down. Behind every breathtaking bodysuit, every swirling dragon and tragic hero etched in flesh, there stood the unsung artisans of Edo, Japan, the Horishi, or tattoo masters. They worked quietly in tucked-away corners of the city, anonymous rooms above tea houses, back rooms of barbershops, or candle-lit apartments that smelled of incense and ink. There were no flashing signs, no customer reviews, just reputation, passed by word of mouth and inked skin. Becoming a Horishi was no casual decision. It took years of training, usually through apprenticeship under a master. The tools were basic, wooden handles with clusters of steel needles at the tip, dipped into a thick black ink called sumi, made from soot and animal glue. The technique? Painstakingly slow and deeply painful. The needles were jabbed rhythmically into the skin by hand, often with a bamboo mallet. This process, called tabori, required steady hands, infinite patience, and the mental endurance of a monk. But Horishi weren't just craftsmen. They were storytellers, historians, psychologists. A good tattoo master had to understand not only how to tattoo, but what to tattoo. Every design carried meaning. A cherry blossom fading into waves, the transience of life, a tiger climbing a mountain, bravery in the face of impossible odds. The client might bring a request, but the horishi would decide the placement, the balance, the soul of the piece. Clients would return over and over, sometimes for years, to complete their full suit. A bodyscape that stretched from shoulder to thigh, across the back, down the arms, and often stopping just above the wrist and neckline. This wasn't random. Tattoos had to remain hidden beneath daily clothing to avoid trouble with the authorities. Some horishi signed their work, not visibly, but secretly, within the folds of a dragon's tail, or hidden in the petals of a lotus. These subtle signatures became a badge of pride, recognizable only to those in the know. Despite the intimacy of the work, horishi lived with 1 foot outside of society. Their clientele were often firemen, gamblers, courtesans, people outside the elite. So the artists too lived on the edge, revered by the underground, invisible to the powerful. Irezumi wasn't just something you wore, it was something you survived. Every line, every shade, every drop of colour came at a price, measured in hours of motionless endurance and days of aching flesh. In Edo, Japan, the pain of tattooing wasn't a drawback, it was the entire point. Tebori, the traditional hand-poked method used by horishi, was brutal by design. The artist would dip the cluster of needles into sumi ink, then tap them rhythmically into the skin using a wooden stick or mallet. The process was slow, incredibly slow. A single outline could take hours. A full-body tattoo might require years of regular sessions, each lasting half a day or more. There were no numbing creams, no mercy. Only the sound of steady tapping and the raw sting of every puncture. But the pain was more than physical. It was symbolic. It separated the dilettantes from the devoted. It was a test of will, patience, and mental control. Clients didn't just receive tattoos. They earned them, and the endurance it took to sit through these sessions became a badge of honour, often discussed with quiet pride in bathhouses and taverns. Firefighters believed that the agony strengthened their courage. Gamblers viewed it as a test of luck and loyalty. Courtesans and lovers took on the pain as a symbol of their emotional depth. For some, it was a punishment. For others, purification. There was a spiritual dimension to it as well. Enduring pain was seen as a kind of self-discipline, similar to fasting or meditation. Buddhist themes were common in Irezumi, not just because of their aesthetic value, but because they reflected ideas of suffering, rebirth, and enlightenment. With each completed session, a person didn't just come closer to finishing a tattoo, they came closer to transformation. And there were rules. You couldn't flinch, you couldn't cry out. Moving too much could ruin the design, or earn you a scolding from the horishi. Only the most serious clients completed their full bodysuit, known as muniwari, with a chest panel left blank to avoid shocking society if the robe fell open. In a world where the elite wore silk and status, the tattooed wore pain and permanence. Every inch of an Edo tattoo told a story. These weren't random designs picked from a menu. They were mythologies mapped onto the body. Carefully chosen symbols, each one with layered meanings, encoded in swirling ink that stretched from shoulder to ankle. For the tattooed in Edo, Japan, the body became a canvas of personal folklore. Take the koi fish, for example. It wasn't just decorative. A koi swimming upstream represented strength, determination, and the willingness to face impossible odds. According to legend, a koi that reached the top of the waterfall became a dragon. It was the perfect metaphor for a man trying to climb his way out of the lower classes, to prove something the world refused to see. Dragons were everywhere, but they weren't the fire-breathing monsters of Western myth. They were protectors, spiritual guardians, powerful, wise, and deeply tied to the forces of nature. A dragon coiling across the back wasn't meant to intimidate, it was meant to shield. A constant, unseen presence between your skin and the world. Peonies symbolized bravery with a touch of elegance, Tigers stood for ferocity and resolve. Waves meant life's unpredictability. Demons and ghosts. Warnings, cautionary tales inked into the flesh as reminders of the dangers lurking in both the physical and spiritual world. Many tattoos depicted full scenes from Chinese and Japanese folklore, battles, betrayals, divine interventions. Popular subjects included the Suikoden, a Chinese epic about 108 outlaw heroes. These stories resonated with the tattooed class. Rebels, protectors, misfits who didn't quite fit into the samurai ideal, but still lived by a code. Buddhist deities were common too, particularly the wrathful ones. Figures like Fudo Mu, the immovable protector. With sword in one hand and rope in the other, he bound demons and cut through ignorance. Having him tattooed on your back was like carrying a spiritual bodyguard, one who didn't mind getting violent when necessary. But not all meanings were universal. A tattoo's placement, size and direction all mattered. A tiger climbing upward might mean ambition. Downward could suggest a warning. Even the order of when each section was tattooed said something about your journey. These symbols were sacred, private, and powerful. And in a society where words could betray you, tattoos became the most honest form of expression. As the Edo period progressed, the vibrant underground culture of Irezumi, once a secret code of honor among laborers, firemen, and gamblers, began to collide head-on with shifting social attitudes and rising paranoia from the ruling class. What was once admired in hidden bathhouses and tea houses slowly became associated with crime, deviance, and dishonor. The turning point came when the government began tightening its grip on public behavior. Tattooing, already unofficially frowned upon, started to take on a more dangerous reputation, especially as it became more visible among the bakuto, or gamblers, and other criminal groups who would eventually give rise to the modern yakuza. These men were often the only ones bold enough to wear full bodysuits openly, and as they became more organized, so did the stigma attached to their ink. Ironically, many of these same criminals had begun as outcasts from society, men who wore tattoos not to provoke fear, but to reclaim identity. But once crime syndicates began using tattoos to mark membership, territory, and loyalty, public perception shifted. The police didn't care whether your dragon symbolized courage or your koi fish meant perseverance. To them, tattoos now signaled one thing: criminality. The government responded with more bans. In the early 1800s, tattooing was officially outlawed, though enforcement varied depending on the region and who was doing the inspecting. Still, tattoo parlors went deeper underground. Horishi had to work in secret. Clients booked sessions through coded language. And artists began developing techniques to hide tattoos under layers of ink, or blend them into larger designs to confuse officials. The stigma wasn't just legal, it was social. Anyone visibly tattooed could be refused entry into public bathhouses, barred from temples, or denied marriage by respectable families. Tattooed bodies became taboo, and the art form, once a mark of bravery or spiritual symbolism, was recast as something vulgar, dangerous, even evil. But the tattoos didn't disappear. They simply went deeper, both under the skin and under the radar. For every government crackdown, there was a new design, a new hiding spot, a new client willing to endure pain for something meaningful. Irezumi didn't die. It went into hiding, like a coiled dragon, waiting. As Japan stepped into the modern age with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the new government was eager to present the country as civilized, orderly, and most importantly, westernized. And in this new image of modern Japan, tattoos had no place. Irezumi, with all its cultural depth and underground prestige, was declared a stain. The government doubled down. Tattooing was not only criminal, it was now embarrassing. Something savage. Something shameful. Foreign diplomats were horrified by the elaborate bodysuits worn by Edo's working class, and Japan, desperate to be taken seriously by the West, responded by pushing tattooing deeper underground than ever before. Yet even as it was banned for Japanese citizens, tattooing curiously became a tourist attraction. British and American sailors flocked to Japanese ports and sought out horishi to take home pieces of exotic oriental body art. Ironically, the very art form Japan sought to bury was being preserved by the very foreigners whose approval they craved. And still, the tradition didn't die. Horishi adapted. They changed their clientele, moved their studios further into secrecy, and kept the Tebori method alive. Master-apprentice lineages survived in whispers. The techniques, symbolism, and tools were passed down carefully, often within families or tightly knit artistic circles. In the 20th century, Irezumi became deeply entangled with the Yakuza. The full bodysuit, hidden beneath business suits, became a symbol of loyalty and fear within the criminal underworld. Once again, tattoos were about pain, honor, and secrecy, but this time without the folkloric grace of Edo firemen or mythological koi. The art was still there, but the public had turned away. Even today, the legacy of that stigma lingers. Despite modern interest in tattoo culture worldwide, Japan still views tattoos with suspicion. Public baths, gyms, and even some beaches ban tattooed individuals. The fear of criminal association endures, even when the ink is harmless. But times are shifting. Young Japanese artists are reclaiming Irezumi, not as rebellion, but as heritage. Museums are preserving ancient designs. Art lovers and historians are finally acknowledging the craftsmanship. And a new generation is asking, why should we be ashamed of our own skin? In a culture built on layers, of robes, of meaning, of silence, Irezumi remains the most honest expression Japan ever tried to hide.
In Renaissance Europe, discussing sex openly was taboo, unless, of course, you were doing it through a thick Latin manuscript wrapped in religious guilt and printed under church supervision. Enter the marriage manual, a strange genre of literature where theologians, monks, and celibate scholars explained how good Christians were supposed to get busy, solely for the purpose of procreation, naturally. These manuals were less 50 Shades and more 46 permissible positions for the glory of God. Titles like De Matrimonio or The Book of the Family disguised what they really were. Deeply detailed guides on when, how, and why married couples could engage in sexual activity, complete with diagrams, calendars, and lists of forbidden days. Spoiler, there were a lot of forbidden days. Sex on Sundays? Sinful. Feast days? Absolutely not. During Lent? God forbid. In fact, there were roughly 180 days a year when marital intimacy was prohibited. Combine that with the fear of damnation and the local priest snooping around, and it's a wonder Renaissance Europe ever managed to reproduce. These guides also gave advice on the proper mindset during intercourse. Joy was suspicious. Passion was risky. Love was fine, as long as it didn't make you too enthusiastic. Women were encouraged to be submissive and silent, and men were warned not to let their desire burn too brightly. Basically, the goal was spiritual union, with just enough physical action to make a baby and nothing else. But despite the dry language, these books were wildly popular, especially among clergy. Some manuals even had sections explaining which sexual positions were natural versus unnatural. Missionary was divine. Anything else was basically flirting with excommunication. Of course, educated Renaissance readers knew how to read between the lines. These books were some of the only texts that acknowledged sex at all, so people devoured them, not necessarily for pious reasons. A marriage manual on your shelf was totally acceptable. What you highlighted in it was your business. Ironically, the strict moral codes these books promoted only made people more curious about what lay beyond them. Which is why, right next to the marriage guides, another kind of book began to circulate, less holy, more illustrated. On the surface, they were scientific marvels, detailed anatomical treatises, often illustrated by respected artists and backed by university scholars. But for anyone with half an imagination and a locked drawer, these books had a certain extracurricular appeal, especially when the female form was involved.
The Renaissance saw an explosion of interest in human anatomy, thanks to dissection being legalized in certain regions and artists like Leonardo da Vinci pushing the boundaries of scientific observation. Texts like De Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius were considered groundbreaking medical references. They were also, whether intentionally or not, kind of steamy. Why? Because they showed women naked, in exquisite, clinical, full-body detail. Breasts, hips, genitalia, nothing was omitted. And while the official purpose was to educate, let's just say not every reader was there for the lymphatic system. These images were often presented with artistic flair. One particularly infamous edition of an anatomical book showed a nude woman, gracefully reclining as if in a Botticelli painting, except her chest cavity was flayed open like a diagram in a butcher's manual. It was both horrifying and oddly sensual. The body as art, the body as science, and for some, the body as entertainment. Since pornography was strictly banned by the church, these illustrations slipped through the moral net under the guise of medical necessity. A young man caught with a suggestive woodcut from a medical book could simply shrug and claim he was pursuing his studies. The fact that the page was dog-eared and mysteriously thumb-worn, irrelevant. Some printers even leaned into the dual appeal. Certain editions were produced with extra attention to the female form, featuring idealized nudes that blended anatomy with eroticism. A sort of Renaissance loophole. If you wanted to look at naked people, all you had to do was pretend to care about the spleen. And these weren't back-alley publications. They were printed by respected presses, collected in university libraries, and cited by physicians. But between the dry Latin and muscle diagrams, there was just enough soft-core temptation to keep readers flipping pages with slightly more enthusiasm than necessary. Of course, not all forbidden books were pretending to be scientific. Some didn't even bother to hide it. By the mid-Renaissance, a new kind of book began appearing in private collections, ones that didn't bother with anatomical dissection or theological loopholes. These were full-blown love manuals, half etiquette guide, half soft seduction playbook. They were written for the well-bred nobleman or lady who wanted to flirt without falling directly into hell. Unlike the dry, rule-bound marriage manuals sanctioned by the church, love manuals revelled in ambiguity. They walked a thin line, offering tips on courtship, letter writing, and romantic speech, all under the pretense of cultivating refined behaviour. But between the lines, they dripped with innuendo. These books taught the art of the glance, the science of sighing in someone's direction, the importance of hand placement during a slow court dance. They offered sample dialogues, thinly disguised pick-up lines, for situations like encountering a duchess in a garden, or complimenting a lady's lute playing without offending her chaperone. One popular genre was the epistolary romance, collections of fictional love letters between imaginary nobles, usually with names like Count Lorenzo and Lady Fiorella. These were meant to model virtuous behaviour, but many letters veered suspiciously close to fantasy. You could practically hear the bodices tightening and the gloves slowly coming off. Some of these manuals even included miniature poems and riddles, just enough to feel cultured, just vague enough to be interpreted as scandalous. The Renaissance reader loved double meanings, and love manuals delivered them in elegant, rhyming couplets. And let's not forget the advice on grooming. One manual suggested men keep their fingernails clean and teeth white, so that a woman when kissed feels neither scratched nor offended. Others reminded ladies to maintain fresh breath and avoid onions before a romantic conversation. Practical, but not exactly spiritual. While these books didn't depict physical intimacy, they hinted at it constantly, and that was the point. They were less about lust and more about tension, the kind that built slowly across candlelit ballrooms, behind fans, through veils. For young nobles trapped between arranged marriages and strict religious codes, these manuals were escape hatches, legal to own, dangerous to understand. While the church cracked down on sin, and scholars argued about virtue, some Renaissance readers were stashing ancient Roman poetry under their pillows. and not the kind Cicero would have approved of. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, was one of the most widely circulated forbidden texts of the Renaissance. Technically a Roman classic, it offered a step-by-step guide to seduction, from spotting a lover at the theatre to how to feign jealousy, just enough to keep things spicy. It was witty, elegant, and totally immoral by church standards. Naturally, it was extremely popular. Educated men, and some very determined women, kept copies of Ovid hidden behind Bibles, or bound in blank covers to pass unnoticed. Marginalia in some surviving copies includes notes like, "Try this at Carnival" and "Worked on Cecilia," because who said Latin had to be boring? Then there was The Golden Ass by Apuleius, a novel that slipped under the radar thanks to its mythological storyline, but included vivid scenes of transformation, lust, and the occasional talking donkey. It was technically a spiritual allegory. It was also erotica with a toga on. Even more daring were translations of Greek and Arabic love poetry, many of which emphasized sensual pleasure as a path to enlightenment. Renaissance Italy had a taste for the exotic, and Arabic texts, like those inspired by the Perfume Garden, circulated in small elite circles. These weren't openly sold, but if you had the right connections and enough gold, a copy might find its way to your study. Booksellers knew how to play the game. Officially, their shops were stocked with theology and grammar. Unofficially, a wink and a discreet coin could earn you access to a locked cabinet labelled Medical Curiosities or Private Readings. The church called it sinful. The merchants called it good business. Some nobles even commissioned illuminated manuscripts of these works, decorated with gold leaf, cherubs, and occasionally very detailed illustrations of things cherubs should not be watching. These books weren't just read, they were experienced, passed around at salons, whispered about at masquerades, banned by bishops, quoted by poets. And while everyone pretended they'd only read them for the Latin practice, the truth was obvious. For all the secret reading and scandalous giggling behind lace fans, the Renaissance wasn't a safe haven for literary freedom, especially not when the Inquisition was watching, and in Italy it always was. By the mid-1500s, the Catholic Church had grown increasingly suspicious of books that could corrupt the soul, which in practice meant anything remotely entertaining. In 1559, Pope Paul IV issued the first official Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It was exactly what it sounded like, a hit list of texts deemed too dangerous, heretical, or, God forbid, titillating. The list included everything from Protestant theology to astrology manuals, but buried among them were treatises on love, anatomy, and even poetry. Ovid, banned. Boccaccio's Decameron, banned. Anything by Erasmus that even hinted at individual thought, double banned. The church wasn't just trying to save souls, it was sanitizing the entire intellectual bloodstream. Possessing a forbidden book didn't just mean a slap on the wrist. If you were a printer, merchant, or noble caught with one, you risked public penance, house searches, confiscation, and even imprisonment. More than one scholar found himself summoned to explain why he had a Latin copy of The Art of Love tucked between Aristotle and Aquinas. But the funny thing about banning books is that it usually makes them more desirable. Underground markets thrived. Printers in Venice, Lyon, and Basel published clean editions for public sale, and uncut, readers' editions for private clients. The difference might be a missing passage, a toned-down illustration, or a completely fake title page. One infamous copy of The Golden Ass was rebound as Sermons of St. Augustine. Talk about a plot twist. Noble families with private libraries developed entire systems for hiding forbidden texts. Secret compartments, false bindings, mirrored cabinets. It was part espionage, part erotica. A well-curated bookshelf said, "Yes, I fear God, but I also read Rabelais." Women were particularly clever about this, since they were less likely to be targeted as intellectual threats. They often acted as literary couriers, borrowing, copying, and circulating books under the pretense of devotional reading. One nun in Naples allegedly kept a copy of The Perfumed Garden behind her copy of Lives of the Saints. Censorship may have ruled publicly, but in private, Renaissance readers just turned the page more carefully. Behind convent walls, away from the judgmental eyes of society and the ever-looming index of forbidden books, Renaissance nuns had access to their own libraries, and some of them were anything but holy. While convents were often seen as bastions of chastity and devotion, the truth was more complicated. These were also places of literacy, intellectual curiosity, and yes, suppressed desire. Many young women entered religious life not by choice, but by family arrangement. Too expensive to marry off? Send her to the nuns? Too outspoken? Cloister her. The result? A generation of women who were highly educated, forcibly celibate, and bored out of their minds. Enter the convent library. On the surface, these collections were pious and respectable. Saints' lives, theological commentaries, devotional poetry. But dig deeper, and you'd find marginalia scrawled in the corners, entire passages underlined with suspicious enthusiasm, and in some cases, handwritten copies of banned love poetry, tucked discreetly between prayer books. One nun in Ferrara was famously reprimanded for translating Ovid's Amores into the vernacular, allegedly for educational purposes. Others wrote their own verses, coded, melancholic, and often steeped in longing. Scholars today suspect that some of the most passionate Renaissance sonnets, attributed to anonymous courtly ladies, were actually penned by cloistered women using writing as a kind of romantic escape hatch. And it wasn't just poetry. Some convents had copies of anatomical treatises, ostensibly for medical knowledge, since nuns often acted as nurses. But as we've seen, anatomy books were rarely just about medicine. One abbess in Florence even petitioned to keep her convent's illustrated anatomy manual on the grounds that it helps the younger sisters understand temptation, which is a very creative interpretation. Of course, the church tried to regulate what was read behind those walls, but literacy meant autonomy, and autonomy meant subversion. Forbidden texts circulated quietly between trusted hands. Pages were memorized, copied, passed along with coded bookmarks. The scent of ink and vellum became, for some, more intoxicating than incense. In the silence of evening, after vespers and confession, a young nun might light a candle and open a worn book, not of scripture, but of something warmer. A poem, a story, a stolen fragment of a world she'd never touch, but could still imagine. Because sometimes, the most forbidden books weren't about lust. They were about freedom. Not all forbidden books were kept in libraries or chained to monastery shelves. Some were hidden in aprons, buried under floorboards, or whispered from memory in back alley markets. These weren't printed by respected presses or debated in salons. These were the other Renaissance texts, the magical ones. Handwritten grimoires, herb manuals, and charm books passed between midwives, herbalists, and women who were definitely not calling themselves witches, but everyone else was. Love was power, and power, especially when exercised by a woman, was dangerous. That's why love spells were among the most feared and popular forms of forbidden knowledge. Renaissance charm books often included instructions on how to win affection, cause obsession, or rekindle a cold marriage. A strand of hair, a cup of wine, a muttered phrase beneath the full moon. It wasn't theology, it was folk science. And it worked, or at least it felt like it did. One famous spellbook from southern Italy included a ritual for ensuring fidelity. Sow a pinch of dried basil into your lover's doublet, whisper their name 3 times, and sprinkle rose water on their pillow. If they dreamed of you that night, the magic had taken hold. If they didn't, well, there were stronger measures. Aphrodisiacs were another staple of these underground texts. Recipes blended Renaissance botany with medieval imagination. Cinnamon, anise, ground oysters, mandrake root. Sometimes effective, sometimes toxic. One apothecary's manual cheerfully recommended a mixture of honey, wine, and powdered stag antler to awaken the fires of Venus. he failed to mention the violent nosebleeds. Men were curious, but women were the primary readers and keepers of these texts. Many passed recipes and rituals from mother to daughter, especially in rural areas where priests visited infrequently and midwives handled everything from birth to heartbreak. But owning such a book was a gamble. The Inquisition didn't look kindly on women with too much knowledge, and a love spell was just a witch trial waiting to happen. So pages were hidden, burned, or disguised as herbal journals. You could be an herbalist on Tuesday and a heretic by Thursday, depending on what someone saw or imagined. By the late Renaissance, the printing press had changed everything. Books were no longer handcrafted treasures for the elite. They were commodities. And while Gutenberg may have started with Bibles, it wasn't long before printers discovered a far more lucrative market: desire. Venice became the capital of this quiet revolution. It had the perfect mix of wealth, lenient censors, and a healthy appetite for vice. Hidden behind religious tracts and scholarly commentaries, small, privately circulated books began to appear. Books that weren't coy about their contents. They didn't pretend to be anatomy manuals. They didn't disguise poetry as devotion. These were explicit, illustrated, and ready to shop. One of the most infamous of these was I Modi, translated as The Positions. Originally created by engraver Marcantonio Raimondi, with illustrations by Giulio Romano, it depicted 16 scenes of explicit intimacy. Each engraving was paired with poetic verses by Pietro Aretino, whose sharp wit and even sharper tongue earned him a reputation as the Renaissance's first pornographer. Needless to say, the church was not amused. I Modi was immediately banned, plates were seized, copies destroyed. Raimondi was arrested. But the damage, or depending on your perspective, the innovation, was done. The idea that you could use the printing press for erotica had been unleashed, and it wasn't going back in the bottle. Underground presses sprang up across Europe, printing slim volumes of love poetry, scandalous tales, and sometimes outright smut. These weren't mass-produced. Copies were expensive, meant for wealthy patrons with a taste for the forbidden. Some were even commissioned privately, with content tailored to the buyer's fantasy. Think of it as custom Renaissance fan fiction. Printers developed clever tricks to avoid detection. Fake title pages, false publishing locations, printed in Constantinople, or Latin phrases that made the books look like harmless philosophy. In reality, they were often illustrated with woodcuts or copper engravings that made anatomy textbooks look tame. For the right price, you could have a book that thrilled, amused, or shocked, without ever admitting you owned it. Many nobles kept theirs in cabinets with special keys. Some had bindings that, when shelved, looked like dictionaries or psalters. The printing press didn't just democratize knowledge, it made lust portable. And with every new title, Renaissance readers got one step closer to something revolutionary: pleasure without permission. By the end of the Renaissance, the line between education, entertainment, and seduction had blurred beyond recognition. What began as anatomical curiosity or theological instruction had transformed into a secret bookshelf of longing, one that crossed gender, class, and even religious boundaries. And that's precisely what made it so dangerous. To the church, these books represented moral decay. To scholars, they were intellectual experiments. But to the people actually reading them, noble women, students, nuns, even merchants, they were something else entirely: power. Not the kind won on a battlefield or in a courtroom, but the quieter, more subversive kind that starts in the margins of a book. In an age where women's bodies were controlled, their voices silenced, and their desires shamed, these books offered an alternative script, a place where love wasn't always arranged, where pleasure could be named, and where curiosity didn't have to be confessed in Latin. Whether it was a love spell hidden in a herb manual, a censored sonnet copied by hand, or a banned poem read by candlelight, each was a rebellion in disguise. And let's not forget the men. For all the public bravado and church-sponsored guilt, they were buying these books too. Philosophers who debated virtue by day might go home and read The Golden Ass with a glass of wine. Priests who condemned lust from the pulpit sometimes kept a copy of Ovid tucked beneath their cassocks. Human nature, after all, has always been good at compartmentalizing. The forbidden bookshelf wasn't just a Renaissance quirk, it was a reflection of a world wrestling with change. The printing press had opened Pandora's box. Literacy was spreading. Ideas were getting harder to control. And once people realized that books could make them feel something, deeply, privately, even sinfully, there was no going back. Most of these books didn't survive intact. They were burned, hidden, miscatalogued. But some did. They sit today in museum vaults and rare book rooms, fragile and foxed with age, still humming with the echoes of secrets whispered across centuries. Because the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and science. It was a rebirth of desire. And in between the sermons and sculptures, the forbidden books tell us everything the marble couldn't.